Alright guys, so welcome to session 3 of the 2014 Sit and Go Boot Camp. In today's session, we're going to be talking about anti-strategies, essentially more plays that you can add into your repertoire, add into your bag of tricks so that you can hopefully increase your ROI, have a greater edge over the table, and especially the regs. We're going to talk about regs. We're going to talk about fish today. How to build some pots and put yourself in position to pick up chips against players that are non-regs. And we've talked so much about regs in the first two sessions because they're the ones that sometimes many people get scared of, or they feel the games aren't profitable anymore. So hopefully now you feel a little bit more comfortable with playing at reg fill tables, understanding where you can get your get even a greater edge, in those particular games. So again, I want to reiterate that, as I said in that first session that we had, seems like this keeps coming up. It's not about completely changing your way of play. It's about understanding when opportunities present themselves, whether that's a tight reg to your left or you have randoms to your left, understanding how to take advantage of those situations when they present themselves. And if we've talked a lot about it. If we take the first session of raising any two cards through a tighter table or a reg fill table, if that opportunity doesn't present itself, if you only have randoms to your left, then you can't use that strategy. You go back to your solid sit and go fundamentals that you've all learned. So understanding when to use these strategies and when not to use these strategies, as I said, is really optimal play. And for today, we're going to add in, I guess, 4 or 5 new strategies or some additional strategies into your bag of tricks to help you pick up chips in some more spots that maybe you aren't currently. So we went over when to open up potentially with any 2 cards, when we can open really wide from any position at the table, and as you saw, that can be really profitable. And that's one of the most profitable strategies that you can add into your game because it's something that pops up every single game. And the same goes for what we did in session 2, which was go over raising versus shoving and looking at the 10 big blind shove and saying, hey, against certain opponents, against the regs, we don't have to shove all in with 12 big blinds or less. We can do some more things such as raise instead of shove, and again, it can be quite profitable. So those are probably the 2 most important strategies because they occur so frequently. So if you nail down those, you should instantly see an increase in your ROI. What we're going to go over today are some additional situations. Like I said, I think there's about 4 or 5 different situations that pop up. Not every single game, but they do pop up, and it's best to know, how you can take advantage of these situations when they present themselves. So as I said, we'll be talking about anti-strategies versus regs and also exploiting fish, putting yourself in position to maximize your opportunities to pick up chips when the fish, the random players at your table, are spewing chips all around the table. You want to be the recipient of those chips. So we'll talk about some ways that we can do that. So the first strategy that I want to start discussing is small blind stealing. This is probably one of the areas of my game that I've improved on the most as I started to implement some more exploitable strategies. And I think it's an issue that a lot of players have in terms of being in the small blind, especially when you're deeper. You're not in the shoving stack, that we're comfortable with. If you have 12 big blinds, that you could probably just make a plus EV shove and go on your way. But what do you do with 15, 16, 17 big blinds or more, and you don't have a tight player in the blinds? You have a loose passive player. So not giving up the small blind and just giving your chips to the player directly to your left will be a key element to add into your game and figuring out the best way to steal that pot. So, the first thing is, and this is what we've discussed already a little bit in terms of, if you're in the small blind and you've got a reg on your left, and he's a tight player and he's not going to flat too often, and it's only 3 better fold, more often than not, we're going to be stealing, right? That's pretty much common sense. For most of the regs, when you look at their small blind steal stat, you're going to see a 50, 60, 70% steal from the small blind. And that's appropriate. You should be doing that. Now, one thing I'll note is that I personally like to raise 2.2 to 2.5 versus regs in the small blind, especially when I'm deeper. Gives a little bit less room to 3-bet. I know some regs will flat in the big blind because it's not a bad play to do either. So to just keep that in mind, sometimes I see players min-raise out of the small blind when they're like 30 big blinds deep, and I don't think that's a very good play, personally. Or even 20 big blinds. So just something to keep in mind. But this is kind of stuff we've already talked about. How to deal with regs, look at their fold to steal, look at their 3-bet versus steal. And if there's a reg in the small blind or in the big blind and I'm in the small blind, I'm going to be raising more often than not versus that player. Unless all of a sudden they start flatting a ton, 3-betting a ton, whatever. But in general, my default play is to steal, right? Basic stuff. But what happens when you have a player that's really loose and potentially passive, loose aggressive? How do you play against those guys when you're in the small blind and you're at 2550 or 5100 and you don't have a shoving stack that you can make a plus EV shove with? You have, a 1500 stack at big blind 100 and you're sitting there with, jack 9 offsuit or ace deuce off. Many times those guys can really give you headaches. If you're raising, then they call, and then you c-bet, and then they call. And it's not that it's necessarily not a profitable situation to be in with a good hand in a raised pot. So what do you do? Like I said, what do you do against those loose players? And like they can give you headaches. They can force you to feel that you need to fold all the time because you don't have a good hand to play. And what I was trying to figure out, and essentially what I figured out, is that we don't necessarily have to give the chips to especially a loose passive player or a random player in general. I wanted to find essentially the path of least resistance to steal a pot versus those players. So one play I like to do, and again, for the guys that have done coaching, staking with me, or have seen these videos in the past, you'll know this play. Hopefully you've been using it. It's probably one of my favorite plays to add in, or maybe you're using it already. I know some players already use it, and some players, they don't even know what limping is. But I talked before about this, how we were going to talk about the limp steal. So put a 1 in the chat box if you're already using the limp steal, and put a 2 if you're not using the limp steal. Looks like we got a lot of 1s. So many guys are familiar with this play. So you're saying not using it enough. I use it a ton. I love using it against loose passive players. That's who it works best against. I do see players use this play against essentially players they shouldn't be limping against. And I'll talk about that in a second. But obviously this works well against high VPIP, low preflop raise. So the 30-10 guys, the 40-15 type of players that are capable of calling your raise or doing some other random stuff, maybe 3-betting you. But it put you in situations that can be quite difficult. And I also do this in awkward stacks. If I have a 10 big blind stack or an 11 big blind stack, and I'm holding a hand like if you remember back from session 2, we did that Queen 4 offsuit hand, and we had a bet effective 10 big blinds versus a random player, and I said, what should we do? And some players said limp. And the reason I don't want to limp in that situation versus a random is because I know for a fact that shoving is going to be a plus EV play. Sometimes you don't necessarily know if a limp steal is going to be better than the shove, but I do know that shoving is the plus EV play, so I'm going to go ahead and make that. What I wouldn't know is if I had a 13 or 14 big blind stack, now what do we do with Queen 4? Are we going to shove Queen 4 with a 14 big blind stack and risk a healthy stack there? I would not be comfortable with that, and that's a situation where I would use this limp steal. So the point of it is that we're limping versus a loose passive player, and because they're passive, they're typically not going to raise over top of your limp, and therefore you limp, they check, you go to the flop, and you c-bet any flop, whether you hit or miss. We're not trying to hit our hand. That's another mistake I see many players make, is that they limp and then they check the flop because they didn't hit their hand. You're going to miss your hand the majority of the time, but so are they. So you have to be prepared to make a C bet around 50% of the pot, to make this play effective. And one thing I'll also note is that you also have to be prepared many times to do a double barrel, because loose passive players, they will still call the flop. What if the flop is, so there's a question that came in here, what if the flop is the worst of all flops for your hand? What does that mean? If I have 7 deuce offsuit and the flop comes ace king jack, that's probably the worst flop for my hand, but I don't care about that. That might be the worst flop for his hand too. I don't know. Right, and he could have, your hand doesn't matter in this situation. I held 4 deuce offsuit, 9-10 jack. If I had raised and then they called, that's such a different situation because they're capable of calling with those hands. But they could have 5-3 offsuit as well that they're checking with. They could have ace deuce that they're checking with. So don't get hung up on your hand and in the board. I see bet every single board. And a couple people said it's completely irrelevant what you have. So don't worry about it. But I will say, also be prepared and be comfortable with having to double barrel. Now, if you're not comfortable with your post-flop play, that is something that, to work on it, and we won't get into that in this particular boot camp that we're doing. I did it in the last one, in the last course I did, which is for in the members portal that I have. So you need to be prepared for double barreling, because these players will or are capable of calling your raise on the flop. More often than not, they really won't. But if they hit any type of draw, third pair, they probably still will call. And I'll show you an example of a hand, and I'll talk about when to double barrel, when not to double barrel, when we get into some specific hand history examples. But that's something that you kind of need to gauge in your own game, where maybe if you don't feel comfortable post flop, you might want to limit this play. But once you get more comfortable, I think this is a great play to add in, so that you're not always just folding the small blind and giving the person directly to your left chips. Now, I will say that this doesn't work great against guys that are loose and aggressive, guys that are playing 45-35. Those players are probably the most difficult to play against because they're going to do all sorts of crazy stuff. They're going to 3-bet you. They're going to call your raise. They're going to raise over top of your limp. So those are the players that I might be more likely to fold to if they're in the big blind. But loose passive players, I'm going to do the limp steal. Regs, tighter players, I'm going to be raising. So some additional ways to steal these pots. So let's get into a few examples, and I pulled up a few here just to give you an idea of what you should be looking for. So in this situation, 6-5 offsuit, not a great hand. It's folded around to us here, and we've got a guy playing 24-6 in the big blind. I don't necessarily want to raise here, inflate a pot, and play it out of position. So actually, this is kind of a situation. I mean, I guess we have a gut shot, but that's not really great for given the scenario. But this is kind of what you said, Serge, in terms of 4 deuce off on a 9-10 jack board. This isn't a great flop for us by any means. You might think this is a great flop for him. I don't really care. I am go ahead and c-bet 54. I always go either a little bit more or a little bit less than 50% just to make it look different, so it's not a lazy bet. Maybe that's just a superstition on my part, but no more than really like around the 50% area. So 52, 53 chips is what I'll throw out there, and that's the goal. It's as simple as that. It's not groundbreaking, but if you're not using it, it's something to add in. It's pretty straightforward. Hopefully the stats change. There you go. So a 43-10 player. I've got queen 9. I've got close to 14 big blinds total. Don't necessarily want to raise with this stack and get called. Don't necessarily want to shove. So I feel more comfortable with just doing a limp steal. Again, not a great board. Actually, it is a pretty good board in general. But obviously we missed it. So it's a good board to c-bet. And obviously you get folds. Of course, this isn't going to work every single time. And it looks like the GoToMeeting program that we're using knocked out the blinds again. I'm not sure why it's doing that. It's kind of pissing me off. But in this situation, I'm in the small blind. This guy's in the big blind. The big blind is 250 with an ante at 25. And I'm going to limp here instead of, we're both pretty deep. And this is a situation I was talking about before where not a great board for us, but we're going to c-bet it. A little bit less than half pot. Now, what do you guys think when this ace comes? Do you like to double barrel here? Do you like to just check and give up? What's your play? I'll leave it to you guys. Right? It's pretty obvious, right? You definitely want to double barrel here, right? This is a great card to represent on the turn. I might have gone too big with my double barrel here, but nonetheless I did it. And limp the ace pre-flop. Are you questioning? So the question came in and said limp the ace pre-flop. Are you asking whether I'm representing the ace by limping it pre-flop? I mean, against these guys, I'm not really concerned about what I guess I'm concerned about what I'm representing, but not necessarily the validity of how often do I have an ace that I'm limping. It's not convincing the ace. In my mind, it is convincing the ace because you're talking about players that are thinking at the table, oh, does he really represent the ace? Would he limp an ace? That's not the point. This guy sees an ace. He probably missed this board. He doesn't have an ace, and I'm betting pretty big on the ace. That's how I view it. I take a very simplistic approach when dealing with randoms. I don't get too overly concerned with what their mental capacity is in terms of what range they put me on. So I definitely like a double barrel here. If it came like a deuce again or something like that, that may not be the best card because whatever he called with on the flop, that deuce shouldn't change too much. So that's where you're going to need to be aware of what are good situations to double barrel, what are times where you might have to check and give up in certain spots. So and those are some quick examples to show you what it looks like. And even if you have a guy that's playing like 28-17, not extremely passive, but you want to try a play you don't feel comfortable with stealing. I see what I can get away with. Try the limp steal. Add it into your game and see if it works. So any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. If you're not using it, use it. It can be really effective. If you are using it but you're more concerned about the board, don't be. Or else, I'm not limping just to hit my hand by any means. Okay. This is what I call an anti-strategy in terms of anti-set mining. This is a pretty cool strategy if we're dealing with regs. And again, for those that have seen this stuff before, don't answer. But at 10-20, 15-30, do you have, actually before I get into that, there's a question that came in. Do you have a cutoff in terms of VPIP pre-flop raise where you don't use the limp stab? No. No, as you saw in that situation, there were guys that were playing 20 and 9, and then there was a guy that was playing 40 and 15. So it as long as I label them as one, a random, two, they're capable of flatting me, that's all I really need to know. Then I'll just see if it works. So yeah, that's a good question. Now getting into anti-set mining, if you're at 15-30 or 10-20 and you see a reg limp in from early position, what kind of hand do you typically put them on? Pocket pair, small pair, a lot. At 10-20 under the gun, a reg limps, I don't necessarily put a reg on a lot of hands there. Put them on about five to 7 different hands. If a reg limps at 100, 200, then I might be concerned they have pocket aces. I'm not concerned that they have pocket aces at 10-20. In general, look, it's all we can talk about really are generalities, right? Obviously there's always exceptions to the rule, but most players, because this is what is typically taught, is that most players will limp. And again, I'm talking regs here. For the purposes of the next example coming up, I'm talking about regs, not randoms. So regs are typically limping hands like pocket deuces through pocket sevens. Excuse me, pocket sevens to pocket eights. Hands like that. Pocket nines are typically raised. It's good enough to raise. But for the most part, many players will limp those. I also know many regs who will raise with those hands, and that's fine as well if you're just raising with those hands. I think it depends on the table what you should do with your pocket pairs. I'm going to talk about how to play pocket pairs right after this, because I actually think that's an area that I found a lot of players seem to be inconsistent with about. You have pocket deuces under the gun. What do you do with it? And then they kind of change it up every single game, randomly. So what we're going to talk about is when we're facing another reg that limps, and it's a situation I see happen a lot. If we know that, so I asked that question to you guys. If we know that when a reg limps, many times it's going to be a pocket pair, that's like they're playing their hand face up. So how can we exploit that? Right? That's what we want to know. So is this a situation that pops up every single game? No, of course not. But when it does, hopefully you know that here's the play you can make. So here's the play. A reg limps with a small pocket pair. We'll say pocket deuces through pocket eights. So we're going to use what we know against them, and we're going to raise with any two cards. Now, does that mean if we're in middle position we raise with any two cards? No. The further you get away from the button, and actually it's better to be in the big blind or small blind, because you don't want any players left to act behind you. Okay? So it's okay to do from the button, it's better to do from the small blind, and it's actually best to do from the big blind, because there's nobody else left to act. Okay? So that's where your EV of this play is going to be the highest. So let's just say a reg limps from under the gun, middle position, whatever. We assume it's pocket pairs. We raise, and let's say we're at 1530. We'll raise to 110 with any two cards. The reg, thinking that he's probably set mining at this point, but we know in our mind that we know what he has. So he thinks he's set mining, when really that's not the case at all. So he calls, the pot's now about 235 chips. C-bet every single flop, no matter what comes out, and make it about half pot, 115. If the reg raises or calls, what do we know at that point? We know they probably hit their set. Could there be times where their pocket seven gets like a dream board and it's deuce 3, 2, 3, 6 board? Sure, that might be a situation that they don't hit their set. But for the most part, we've shown strength by raising their limp, especially if we're out of position. We then c-bet. They're typically going to move forward with the hand if they've hit their set. Okay? So if we know that, that's how, if we know that that's their play, that's how we can exploit it. So many times we're going to be getting tons of folds on the flop, and if they don't fold, we can just give up. Even if you actually have pocket aces, if you raise pre-flop, they limp call, and then you c-bet and then they call, I would actually be very concerned at that point that your pocket aces are beat. So let's take a look at what that calculation looks like, and then we can use the Card Runners EV program to calculate that. So let's take a look. So I have under the gun here, raises with pocket deuces, limps with pocket deuces through pocket eights. I'll put ourselves in the big blind. I said we're going to raise any two cards. Right? We're going to raise all hands to 110. Under the gun's going to call with all of his hands, meaning deuces through eights. We are going to bet out 115 into the pot. Now let's just say, for simplicity purposes, that every time the player who limped hits a set or better, so that includes a full house, or set or better, he's going to raise us. And let's just say raises to the 300. Of course they could call, but again, we'll assume that is what we're going to give up as well. So anytime he does that, we're going to, he's going to either, every time he hits one of those hands, he's either going to raise or he's going to fold if he misses. And then if he raises, we're obviously folding every single one of our hands, even pocket aces. Okay? So what we want to look at here is, let's see the calculation of this play if if we race with 82 cards and c-bet, and it looks like Card Runners EV is running slow. Hopefully, as I'm waiting for that to load, let me actually, here it goes. So take a look at this number right here. It's 0.74. So it's pretty profitable in this situation to raise with any two cards, and go with this scenario. Okay, even if you're off a little bit, or even if he peels an extra card or two, or an extra spot or two, then that's okay. It's not going to make this a negative play. Okay, so there's a question that came in from Alex. Couple spots, the last part of your sequence is a bit tricky, I think. If we raise small blind, big blind out of position, then they continue on low cards in position by calling. Do we barrel a high card turn? And also when it's a 10, jack, or 9 high, sometimes they peel once out of position. That's more the exception to the rule. And I wouldn't necessarily be barreling those spots, because I'm making the assumption that if they're only going to typically move forward with a set or better. Because what have we done? We've shown strength. If we show them this play 1,000 times, sure, they might pick up on it. But it's not like this play happens every single time. But if you have a guy that you've labeled as a reg, and maybe he isn't the best reg, yeah, I'll answer your question in a second in terms of one limper. Yeah, this is going to be against a reg that limps, and I'm going to make the assumption that he's only going to move forward if he hits a set or not. Now, could that assumption be wrong? Sure. Is it 100%? Of course not. But it's enough of a good assumption in my mind, based upon this calculation, that even if we add in some additional situations where they peel a card or anything like that, it might drop this EV maybe to 0.5, 0.4. It's still going to be a plus EV spot, right? Because don't you want to put yourself in a position where you're playing against a player who pretty much what hand he has. Okay, not everybody's going to play their hand the exact same way, of course not. But in general, they're going to proceed very similarly. Could we try a slightly different assumption for a card raising? Like he raises with 3 non-set pairs and 1 bluff. That would probably take a little while to add in all these conditions. Let's just see if he raises. Okay, so let's just say he raises an overpair as well. Let's see, that should work. Hopefully that works. Let me just make sure I did that correctly. So if we just add in an overpair, let's check it out. And if this messes up, then it's something I can do after and post it on the forum. 0.67. If we add in that he's going to raise every time he has an overpair. So that's what I mean. Like, even if we add in some additional spots, this is plus EV enough so that it gives us a cushion. So that's a good question. So somebody had a question. Do we do this against one limper? Yeah, only one limper. And there's another question. I don't think a reg is ever open limping there. I believe over limping for sure, but then there are usually also fish in that pot who might limp call as well, and it's hard to read as they're going to play hands. Yeah, so we're only doing this against one limper, right? And like I said, I'm not saying that this is always going to be the situation, or that every reg is always limping small pocket pairs. Remember what I said. There's a lot of regs that are just going to raise their pocket pairs every single time. If I'm at a reg-filled table, I'm going to be typically, I'm not going to be limping my pocket pairs at all. Okay? I'm talking about the situations in which there is a limper. And maybe they don't limp from under the gun. Maybe it's even middle position. And I'll show you an example where that happened. But, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. I see regs limping many times. Maybe not the best regs, but I see a lot of regs still limping with their pocket pairs. And even if some players aren't, that's fine. Just so you know that this is a play you can make profitably if you see a reg who limps. That's what it comes down to. Okay? Yeah, open limping. Just totally open limping. 10, 20, 15, 30, right? So obviously at 25, 50, and 5100, you see a reg open limp, you might be concerned it's pocket aces. Um, and you might not see it frequently in 180s. Typically on more reg-filled tables, and 180s are getting more reg-filled, it's not the best idea to limp on that table. So let's talk about that right now, actually, in terms of how you should play your own pocket pairs at different tables. And this is what I see. I see a lot of inconsistency in terms of how players are playing with their pocket pairs. The reason that we were kind of all taught and what the basic strategy is to limp with their pocket pairs is because you get to see a flop cheaply, ideally, and you see a flop cheaply and to hit a set, so that you hit your set and hopefully there's other people involved and you get their entire stack. So that's a perfect world scenario, right? But also if you open limp and somebody raises, you can still call and still technically have implied odds when you do hit your set. But who is that for? That's for random players, right? It's not going to be so easy to get another reg's entire stack when you hit your set. Because if they've identified you as a reg and then you're getting it all in on the flop, the turn, whatever it might be, I mean, what are they really going to put you on when you limp and then you're going nuts on the rest of the board? It's pretty obvious. It's kind of what we just said. You hit your set. So I'm not limping at reg-filled tables. I'm limping at tables that are full of players that are random fishy players that aren't paying attention really to what I'm doing. I want to encourage other players to limp in as well. So, as I was saying after being interrupted by the dog, hopefully he doesn't bark again, loose, random tables, yeah, I'm going to be limping in because I want to encourage as many players to limp in as possible so that hopefully I hit my set when they hit top pair, two pair, whatever. At reg-filled tables, I'm not going to limp in. I might either sometimes fold under the gun with pocket deuces or something like that, or just raise my with all my pocket pairs. And go that way. So that's where I would personally, look at my own game, and that's how I'm playing pocket pairs. And like I said, I'm using this concept and saying I know that other people know that if I'm a reg and I'm limping, it's pretty obvious what I have. So I don't want to limp at other reg-filled tables. But if you are at a table where you notice that a reg does limp, hopefully you can apply this particular play. Right? And maybe in your games you're seeing it all the time, maybe you're not. But it does happen. All right? And actually, I'll pull up a play right now, actually. I was going to do this when I talk about ISOing and another strategy. So let's wait for that to load. Hopefully that'll load soon. All right, I'm just going to wait for that to load. I'll come back to it. But so any questions on that? I know we had to simplify the calculation, and obviously players are going to play different. But in general, that's like the anti-set mining strategy. And if you see a reg that's limping to see a flop cheaply. Okay, this next one that I'm going to talk about, steel blinds, very basic, but I think is another play that you can just add into your game to pick up chips along the way. Right? So what I'm about to show you is not groundbreaking at all. It's such an easy concept, but it's something that players aren't doing. And this goes back to what we talked about in session 1. And that's just steal the blinds at the early stages. Even 10, 20, 15, 30, even if you feel 25, 50 is the early stage. Early games, blinds, it's perceived that blinds are not as valuable to steal compared to the late game. And that's absolutely true. And accordingly, right, because of that situation, because we're at such low blind levels, regs aren't going to get too frisky, I guess you could say. They're not going to get too out of control. They're going to play relatively straightforward at big blind 20, 30, and 50. You get a little bit more 3-betting at big blind 50. But for the most part, I see a lot of regs just be completely indifferent at this stage. You raise from the cutoff, regs are in the blinds. They're not going to do too much. Maybe they're still going to flat with pocket pairs and king-queen type hands and see what happens. But in general, it's pretty easy to play against them pre-flop and post-flop. So I'm still stealing from any two cards from late position. I'm not doing it from middle position or under the gun by any means, like we talked about before, when the blinds are higher because the pot isn't as valuable. But if you're in a situation where you're on the button, the cutoff, and you've got tight regs to your left, just go ahead and pick up the chips. It's a free 45 chips, 30 chips, 75 chips. You do that 2 or 3 times, it can add up to an extra 100 or so chips. And that's why I ask, what would you rather have at big blind 150, 1600 or 1400? So it can make a little bit of a difference. And as you know, that even if you have like 10 or 11, 10, 11, 12 big blinds, that's a big difference from 8 or 9 big blinds in terms of your, how you're going to play, shoving all in or just raising. So there's a question. I'd like to point out the implication of the strategy. If you're stealing 82 cards at early blinds in these spots, then your stats will be much looser and your steals may work less when blinds are bigger. Not necessarily. It's not like you're going to do it non-stop. Like I said, your stats overall are going to go to, you see what mine are, 23-19. Another guy I'm working with is playing 25-23. Your stats are going to go up regardless. So whether you're 23-19 or 24-20 or 25-23, it's going to go up. Right? But we saw the math in terms of later in the game how wide certain players are going to have to 3-bet you. And like I said, players, there will be a few, but not all by any means. 90% of players are not going to be able to exploit you. So I'm not going to go nuts in the early stages, but I'm definitely stealing early. Plus, when stealing early, you're gathering some. This is another comment that came in. When stealing early, you're gathering some PFR, so the randoms don't necessarily all fold when you first get a monster after 20 hands and you raise your first time. Yeah, there's some validity to that as well. There's obviously always some metagame to include. I think many times also that metagame is very overrated, and sometimes we level ourselves. Yes, there are some players that you're going to get in leveling battles with. You gave I see a frowny face there. Did I interpret your message wrong, Michael? In terms of randoms, not all folding when you get a monster. If I did, just go ahead and message me. I'll move on. Sorry, I didn't agree with you as much as you like. I agree. There's definitely an element to that where if you've been tight the whole time and all of a sudden you raise, that's a lot different than if you had happened to raise 3 times before that and now you're opening again. It's not as obvious that you're playing such a tight game. So you can obviously use that to your advantage. But again, I don't get too hung up on the metagame and leveling myself in that regards, or in that regard. I adjust when I need to adjust to certain players. That's it. I understand the math. Hopefully you guys understand the math now, from the previous sessions, so that when you're making those plays, the any 2 card raise, the 10 big blind, race fold or race call, you understand the math behind it and when and why it would work and doesn't work. Okay? So that's your strategy now. Deviate from that when need be versus those specific players. So I'm not going to give up spots because I'm afraid of what will happen later on or in the long run. I will give up, like I said before, if you raise 2, 3 times in a row or something like that, sure, I'll scale it back. And just like I explained, in the small blind versus big blind, if I raise with 10 big blinds to the same guy 3 times, I'm going to give him a hand, give him a pass 1 time. But I'm going to keep going. That's more of just for your own balance and for a little bit of balance in your table image. But I'm not going to get too hung up on that. Here's a nice play to add in. Again, it's more of a subjective play rather than something we can calculate. But again, I think it's something that players don't do enough. And that's simply when in position and random players limp at big blind 50, at big blind 100, when you still have 15 big blinds plus, to ISO them in position so that they're limp calling you out of position and then you go ahead and make a C bet and hopefully take it down. Right? That's a great way to add several hundred chips to your stack pretty easily. Okay? Let me see if... Okay, these hands did come up nice. So we'll get to those in a second. So the point of this is, like, at 10, 20, 15, 30, it can still be valuable to just limp, on the button with a suited ace or a suited connector or hands like that. There's a lot of implied odds there. You might want to encourage other players to be involved in the pot as well, so that you have more implied odds. But as you get to 25, 50, and 50, 100, the value to limping starts to decrease, and we don't want to limp at all. And I don't recommend limping at big blind 100 if you're on the button. But we don't necessarily have to fold. If you're sitting there with queen 9 offsuit and you're at 1700 stack and under the gun who's playing 30 and 5 limps in from under the gun, I'm going to be raising with that hand from the button to big blind 100. I'm going to raise to like 250, 275, and hopefully force him to force an isolated pot and make a C bet on every single pot and take it down that way. So I'll show a couple hands where I did that. I think that's probably the better way to go through this. Actually, I think this might be the hand I wanted to get to with... give me 1 second. I think this might be one of the hands I wanted to get to when talking about the limp... the anti-strategy of raising over top of a reg who limps. Let me see. I think I included it here. Yeah. So we'll wait for the HUD to pop up. We don't really need it for our purposes here. But at 1530, Ron P 2012 here is going to limp. He's a reg. He's not a great reg. He's playing 1710. He plays a little bit weird, but he's a reg nonetheless. And here, I have ace 9, which is good enough in general, but I would raise with a ton of hands here. So I'm going to raise him, and he calls, and then he leads out here, which I think is really weird. So it's not the exact same situation. So I wanted to show this as, here's a situation came up where I made the assumption that he was limping to set mine. I raised him. He called. This play here doesn't really make sense with what he was going for, so I went with that assumption, and I just raised him a little bit, and obviously got him to fold. So that worked out well. But just wanted to show you kind of, I went with that assumption, and then I just based my strategy moving forward on that, and that his donk bet here didn't make much sense in my mind compared to what I thought he should be doing. So just wanted to point that out. Yeah, donk bets are often weak. I've made a video on that concept as well. Yeah, he's just guessing I missed the flop, but I want to continue with the one. I'm going to show strength. 2, he wouldn't do that with, or he might do that with a pocket pair, but I think my strength pre-flop and post-flop would get him to fold those anyway. All right, so again, here's a situation, ace 9. We get a random player playing 22-8, and that's who's limping, right, guys? The guys that are limping are the 22-8s, the 28-5s, the 30-17s. That's who we want to be raising, right? So we're going to, at big blind 50, I'll typically go to 150. At big blind 100, I'll probably just go to like 275. And a couple considerations to make here is, one, I have a good enough hand here, but I'll start raising and ISOing wider the tighter the players are to my left. Obviously here we have a very loose table, right? So I'm not going to be ISOing with a very wide range in this position because I might not get into an isolated pot. One of these guys is probably going to flat as well, which is what we really don't want. And then we go ahead and I'm going to be c-betting every single board that that comes out pretty much. When I make a normal raise and somebody calls and I have to decide whether to c-bet, I don't c-bet every single board, but in situations where I'm raising over top of a limper, I will. Because if you think about their situation, they've just limp called out of position. Now they're still out of position, and now we're continuing to show our aggression. So typically, if they call this raise, they probably hit something. Otherwise, they're going to fold. So that's what I'm going. That's what I'm going to do. Queen 10 off. We get a limper here from under the gun again. Do the same thing. I think I checked that back. Alright, so I checked it back because, the only card I'm really scared of coming out is really a king. Probably won't get a ton of value by c-betting on this board if he doesn't have, if he's got an ace, he's going to call. If he doesn't, he's probably going to fold. So that's probably why I checked back. But regardless of the post-flop strategy, that's the type of stuff that I'm doing. And so here's a situation where King 9 suited, not the greatest hand in the world. It's an okay hand. And that's typically what I'm going to do this play with. Hands that can flop okay. I'm not going to do it with any 2 cards. But in this situation, a guy playing 25-6. We've got a tight player in the small blind. A player that's not too loose. Obviously not too tight either in the big blind. Raises to 285. And we get a fold there, which is... I usually don't assume we're going to get many folds pre-flop because we're not raising too big. So I actually don't mind if we get called. But it's just, again, a nice play to add in. Too many times I see people folding this. They fold here because they don't want to raise, they don't want to shove, they don't want to limp in, so they just fold. So what would I raise in this situation? I'd be raising any Broadway hand, any ace, any pocket pair still. Queen 9, 10-9 type hands. I'm going to be doing all of those. So here, it's where I did it again. The guy who limps in late position. I do it again with 9-7 offsuit. And this is quite simply a situation where it didn't work. Okay, so obviously it doesn't work all the time. That's probably a nice board for him. But this is the play that I'm making. It's going to work more often than not, and it could be a great way to add chips to your stack. Is that so big blind 50, raise it again, we get a fold, so that's all well and good. And typically we're going to be doing this, sometimes you actually get some folds. So typically you're going to be doing this when you're a little bit deeper, and typically 14, 15 big blinds or more. So that usually occurs at big blind 50, big blind 100. If you're a little bit deeper, obviously at big blind 150 or 200. But again, I'm not going to do any calculations for it because it's more of a subjective play. But if you find yourself that you're not ISOing randoms or fishy players in position, you probably should be more. So any questions on that? Like I said, we're kind of just doing a shotgun approach here of adding in some more plays to your, all the tools that you have, so that hopefully, you add all of these things into your game, from the raising with any 2 cards to the 10 big blind raise fold or raise call instead of a shove, to the raising over top of a reg who limps, to the limp steal, now ISOing fish. These are all plays that you can now add into your game that hopefully will add more profits out, increase your ROI, either because you were never using those plays before, or you're just adding a more profitable play. Are you only doing this versus fishy players with high fold to c-bet? Nah, because many times you don't have c-bet stats on random players. You might only have, like this guy, I have 23 hands. His c-bet stats are meaningless. But he's playing 30-0 over 23 hands. That's meaningful. So what you do is you just make the general assumption of this guy is going to play very similar to this guy and to this guy. They all have they're loose passive players. They're not very good, and putting yourself in position versus them where they're limp calling out of position is just in general an advantageous spot to be in. So that's what we're going for. So any questions on that? Agree, disagree? It's fine if you disagree. So prefer wider gap between VPIP and pre-flop raise. Typically, I mean, the guys that are playing 45-35. What does that mean? Their stats are telling you that they're typically raising most of their hands, and if they limp, that might actually be a concern that maybe they're actually trying to trap with aces, because they're while they're loose, they're also aggressive and they're raising with a ton of hands. Guys that are playing 47-12, 30-0, 44-14, they're limping a ton of their hands, and if they actually raise, that's probably a better hand. So I was asked to rewind here. The limp stab thing, blind versus blind, against aggro players with a higher than 10% bet, maybe 3-bet where you're going for, you rather fold pre-flop. Yeah, that's what I said, that if you're going against loose, aggressive opponents, then I don't necessarily want to try the limp stab because they're probably going to be raising over top of that limp anyway. I might try it because I'd rather do that than raise. But and we're assuming not a great hand either. I'm still going to be raising my good hands, but the bad hands I'm going to be folding. It's fine to fold there. But against the 47-12 guys, the 30-0 guys, I'm going to be limping with any 2 cards. All right. So that's it for that. All right. So and as you see here, I say be careful of the blinds. When you're in a situation where you're trying to ISO, whether you're on the button or the cutoff, definitely be careful of the small blind and big blind. As you saw in a couple of those hands, there were some really loose players to my left. So if that's the case, I'm still going to ISO, but I'm probably going to limit it to hands that are going to be playing better post flop. If I do happen to go to a multi-way flop, but if let's say there's 2 regs in the blinds and a guy under the gun limped, I'm going to be raising with a very wide range. That includes, as you saw, 9-7 offsuit I raised with. So hands like that. Actually, we already got into examples. So before I jump to the next one, so any questions on that? Make sense? It's pretty straightforward. Well, I discuss more when you have like 15, 16 big blinds. If I'm versus a short stack, or there's a short stack to my left, I'm probably not going to put myself in a position where I'm raising with a very bad hand. To where I'd have to show down that hand in a potentially negative EV spot. So if a guy is sitting in the big blind with 5 big blinds, then I might still ISO with like the Broadway hands and ace-X hands. So at least I might have a little bit of equity versus what that player is going to be shoving all in. But in a perfect world or in more standard world of doing this play, you're not committed to anybody. Your 15 big blinds are so deep so that if you have to put in an ISO raise and then you make a C bet, you haven't crippled your stack either. Okay, so any questions on that? All right, pretty straightforward stuff. But while I say it's straightforward, maybe you're not doing it. It's again stuff that you can add in when the opportunity presents itself, and that's kind of the theme. While we're, like I said, doing a shotgun approach of all these different strategies, it has the overall theme of when the opportunity presents itself, here's a thought on the best way to maximize your EV and then pick up chips. So 3-betting to exploit. This is always a fun one. We've talked about how to exploit other players, right, that are not 3-betting too wide, and how we can race through them with any 2 cards. Well, the question has been posed to me, and in the previous sessions is, how can we combat other people that are raising? What if we notice somebody else raising really wide? What can we do? Well, we can start 3-betting with any 2 cards potentially. So we'll talk about spots where we can do that. So in this spot here that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing a couple calculations in terms of 3-betting to exploit. This is typically going to be versus regs, guys. Versus regs again, not versus randoms. When I'm 3-betting random players, I'm typically 3-betting with more of a value range because you typically don't have as much fold equity as you think you should. They're going to flat your 3-bet, all sorts of stuff. So 3-betting versus randoms, I'm going to be typically sticking to a more value range where I just quite simply think I'm ahead. But versus regs, what we can start doing is figuring out, when can we 3-bet them a little bit wider than normal. And this is where we use, the HUD stats of cutoff raise first, button raise first, their small blind steal stat, where even if you see tight players that are start opening up 30-40% from late position, we can start raising them very wide. Now, the question is, and what usually scares people about 3-betting is, in sit and goes, you're just naturally short stack for the majority of the game. So 3-betting usually means you need to risk a large portion, if not all of your stack. So even if you know somebody's opening really wide and they're calling with a very tight range, it's kind of a scary proposition to, even though the calculations might tell you you could 3-bet with 7 deuce offsuit, you might not feel like shoving your 13 big blind stack all in with 7 deuce offsuit, even though you know that you should. So what we're going to do today is kind of take the concept of raising instead of shoving and moving it one step further to the 3-betting game. Remember when, in session 1 and even in session 2, where I talked about why is raising better than shoving, or in what situations is raising better than shoving? Raising is better than shoving in situations where, 1, the player's not going to flat you when you raise, and 2, their 3-betting range is not going to be drastically different than their all-in calling range. And the same applies for 3-betting. So now we're not necessarily just looking at all-in calling ranges. We're going to ask the question, if we raise, is their 4-betting range now going to be drastically different from their all-in calling range when you 3-bet? And I think that's actually on the next slide. So I kind of already went through this information, and you can read it there. But that's the questions that we're going to be asking. How wide is their 4-betting range? And many times we don't know. But you ask yourself, is it going to be much wider than their all-in calling range if you 3-bet shove compared to 3-betting small? So we're going to do some calculations on that. And of course, ideal opponents, ideal situations. We're doing it versus regs. We're going to look at those cutoff button race first stats. And, in a perfect world, we can look at fold the 3-bet. And I say that's a perfect world because you need thousands and thousands of total hands-on players. Therefore, you have 100 or more, at least 100 or more specific opportunities in which that reg has folded to a 3-bet to start getting a good idea of their fold to 3-bet stat. So if you've got 20,000 games under your belt and you're playing the same games and you've got hands on the same regs, you might have that stat, and that's only going to help you. If you don't have that stat, it's okay. Just don't give a whole lot of credence to their fold to 3-bet stat if you don't have a lot of hands. It might throw you off. And many times what I always ask, when you're in a reg versus reg scenario, put yourself in their position. Would you 4-bet any wider in this situation? And again, we have to make the general assumption that we don't have any ridiculous, metagame leveling stuff going on where he knows that that he's opening with any 2 cards, so therefore you're 3-betting with any 2 cards, therefore he can 4-bet with his entire range. So I don't want to get into that conversation because that's, again, more the exception. And it's not that I want to ignore that because it does happen, but reserve that for those specific players at that time. As I always say, there's going to be situations where, quite simply, their 4-betting range is going to equal their all-in calling range. So we can go ahead and 3-bet much smaller than just shoving all in. So why don't we get into some calculations? And I got these screenshots from a bunch of random players. Let me see if I can make this bigger. So everybody see that? So here, I actually forget which game this is. I think for our purposes, this is going to be a chip EV calculation we're going to do. This might be pre-final table of an 18-man, which we could get specific ICM, but let's just say who cares? Let's do a chip EV calculation. We'll do an ICM one later. So let's take a look at this spot. Fat Afghan over here, who's a popular reg, and I believe these 18-man games. He's a pretty, he's a good player, but he's also pretty tight. He's playing 12-10, 27% open from the button. He's raising to 350, so a lot of people recognize him as a reg. And so he raises here. We have to figure out, we're both kind of deep here. What should we do with 10-3 offsuit? Should we 3-bet jam it? Should we fold? Or should we 3-bet smaller? And so let's take a look at a calculation for that. And one thing I want to note, which I'm going to say, ignore for a little bit right now, but have it in your mind when you're playing the actual game. He's raising from the button through a player that he's committed to. I understand that. So usually when players raise through a player that they're committed to, it might limit their range a little bit to hands that they're comfortable with showing down. So maybe he's a little bit tighter here than normal, just a consideration to keep in mind. So let's go to let's go here. Okay, so first, actually, what I want to do is let's take a look at 3-betting all in. So yeah, he also raised a 350 and he also min raises, which means he probably has a hand like I'm ignoring that for right now. Again, that's information used on your own when you're playing. If we were doing a coaching session and doing a hand history review, that's something that we would point out. For our purposes here, we're looking at the concept of 3-betting small versus 3-bet shoving. So maybe he wanted to do that to prevent getting shoved on, possibly. Let's just take it for what it's worth. Okay. So if you see somebody deviate their pre-flop raise size, then that's something to be aware of and take note of. Didn't I? Hold on. Did I mess up the stacks? Let me see. I think I might have messed up the stacks a little bit. Let me take a look real quick. Okay, so it's more like 3,000. Yep. Let's change that up. My bad. Alright, so let's just give him a 3K stack. And so we have him raising 350. Let's just say he's opening these hands. You know, he's got like a 27% open from the button. That doesn't necessarily mean he's opening with a 27 or 28% range, but he also expects potentially to get called or to show down his hand versus a small blind. So maybe he includes 10-9 suited. Anybody totally opposed to this range? Maybe you think he's tighter. Maybe you think he's a little bit looser. He's a 12-10 player to begin with, so I don't think he's overly loose anyway. So I'll just keep that for right now. And then we are going to give him a calling range. Let's say we 3-bet shove for a 20 big blind stack, essentially. I have him calling with pocket sevens and ace-jack suited. Maybe you think he should be tighter with a 20 big blind stack. Maybe you think he should be a little bit looser. Let's just give him that range. Any tighter, if he calls with any tighter of a range, that's obviously going to be better for us, right? So I'll click this little button here, this maximum exploitable range for the big blind. That's us. And let's see what it pops out. And it's not responding, which is always good, so hopefully it kicks in a second. Okay, so it's chip EV, and you can see that the EV is 204 chips, okay, total, versus this range, versus this particular range. Okay, so plus EV shove with any two cards versus this spot. Okay, the question is, do you feel comfortable 3-betting him with 3-deuce offsuit? No, as I said, we've done a lot of ICM calculations in previous ones, so I figured I would do a chip EV one here, and then I'm gonna come up with another hand in a second that's an ICM spot. So this is a non-ICM spot. Let's just call it. Let's just call it the or middle stages or early game of a 180 man, where there's very little ICM. So this is a chip EV spot. So we pick up 204 chips. Pretty good spot. If you notice this is a spot where we would want to take advantage of. What I want to see is what happens when we 3-bet smaller, right? So we have to question, could we 3-bet smaller, and is that going to be more profitable than a 3-bet shove? Because usually I see people either want a 3-bet shove or they don't do anything because they don't want to 3-bet small either with 3-deuce offsuit, so they just fold instead of doing anything else. So let's just say he's going to raise to 800. Raise to 800, and let's just keep it all the same here. So what I've set up is he's going to raise with the same range. We're going to 3-bet. We're going to figure out what range we can 3-bet with. For right now, I'll put it with any two cards. he's going to 4-bet with the same exact range. Right? So that's the assumption we're going to make. Now, we can probably expect here, and we'll figure out what range we should call with. We could probably expect that if the 4-betting range is not going to change, then we can start making sorry, let me back up. I confused myself as I was reading the question as I was going through here. If the 4-betting range is going to be equal to their 3-bet all-in range or calling range versus your 3-bet, then obviously raising is going to be much more profitable than shoving. So one, it's just good to see that, right? And this is based upon this calling range, so it gives us the best. This is the best calling range we can have. Pocket eights, ace queen, king jack suited. I've always had the feeling that if I jam with 10-3 off type hands and get caught from regs, which I see all the time, it would take me years to repair my image and get some credit again. But use that to your advantage then. Then just 3-bet them with a tighter range that next time. If you feel that way, 3-bet them with a tighter range, or 3-bet them and call them with a wider range. The point here is that we're not going to 3-bet jam. I don't necessarily want to show down the 10-3 offsuit either. So, Alan, you said you would rather jam in this situation than 3-bet? Is that because you make the assumption that someone's going to 4-bet wider? Oh, that's why you're saying you would rather 3-bet small than 3-bet jam. I got you. Yeah. So then the question is, how wide does this 4-bet have to be to make a 3-bet jam better? So let's just add in a couple hands. And let's see what it looks like. So would we pretty much double the? So it's a little bit below now. So because he's 3-betting a little bit wider, it's a little bit below shoving the total EV. I don't remember what 3-deuce offsuit was before. This is a little bit better with if you had the 10-3 offsuit type hand. So we added a few extra hands that he was 4-betting with. Now, why would he 4-bet with these hands, right? The question is, why would he 4-bet you with pocket fours and ace 10 with those hands? That would only be because he typically assumes that you're 3-betting him really wide and that you have a 4-bet folding range. So if we bring him back to like a 5% range, something like that. I think it was it something like that? I think I messed up. Oh, I put that as our calling range. Hold on, I did something wrong there. Oh, I chose button. Is that what I did? All right, I'm just going to back it up. Let me just back it up. Oh, so I screwed up this range. I apologize there, guys. Bear with me for 1 second. Let me get rid of these hands. He's not going to 4-bet with every single hand that he's opening. That's essentially what I had in there. Something like that. I think that was it. So we essentially have to double his 4-betting range to make a shove better, right? Now, with that being said, why would he double his 4-betting range? It's because he feels that you have a 4-bet folding or a 3-bet folding range. Sometimes that's the situation, sometimes it isn't. I just think it's good to go through this spot and show that look, we can 3-bet small when we don't expect to get one, someone's not going to flat us, or they're not going to 4-bet us much wider than they would call the all-in. All right? So it's not as drastic of a difference as we saw when raising versus shoving in terms of somebody has to 3-bet you really, really wide. The 4-betting range doesn't need to get too drastic to make it a little bit less profitable than shoving. But with that being said, they still have to have the concept of being able to exploit you before I'm going to start shoving rather than raising. So I know we kind of put in a bunch of ranges, jump back and forth. Does that make sense? In general, it's better to raise smaller than shove all in, right? Only deviate from that strategy if someone's going to 4-bet you much wider, or at least double their range that they would call the all-in with. You know, so then the question is, how deep can we be when making this play? Let's take a look. Let's go to a 2,000 stack, and we'll compare. Do we want to do a 2,000 stack? No, that's too short. I think I want to do like 2,500. Can we do it down to 2,500? Let's do this. So you can see it's still quite profitable. Is it better than shoving? Let's find out. And it's better than shoving, right? And 3-deuce offsuit is obviously much better. I remember seeing it was like 280 chips plus EV for 3-deuce off, where it's 163 positive chips for shoving. So that's where you're really looking as what are you going to do with the worst hands? We know what's easy to do with the better hands. What are you going to do with the worst hands? And hopefully just seeing these numbers, it makes 3-betting smaller, a little bit more comfortable to do. Let me get into the next example, actually. And this is the exact same situation. I'm not going to do a calculation on this one, but again, it's the exact same scenario. And what I'd say about that is, if I'm 3-betting somebody in this, like this is the same spot, Fat Afghan here comes around, it's going to raise to him. Would you 3-bet him with Ace-6? You probably could. But again, it's okay to maybe do it 2 times. Maybe don't necessarily do it 3 times. Keep up appearances, essentially. You don't want to get too out of control. We've talked about that before. So same spot, still another good 3-betting spot. If you do it once or twice in the same spot, give him a pass another time for that, extra metagame stuff. Here's an interesting spot, and this is an ICM spot. This is an 18-man. This is 5-handed 18-man, therefore it's the bubble. And we have our hero here who's the chip leader. We've got a couple, 7 big blind stacks. And then we have the guy who's second in chips open up for middle position, who is, I think, Reg E. I'm not sure how good of a Reg E is. Not as familiar with him. He opens up. Now, our hero here, who's a very solid player, he decided to 3-bet jam over him because given the stack distribution on the bubble, the guy who's second in chips, he can't call necessarily without aces, kings, and queens because of such a high bubble factor and ICM tax. What do you guys think about this play? Do you think it's a plus EV play to begin with or a negative EV play? No, see, I don't think this is a fancy play syndrome. This should be a more common play. Maybe you don't feel comfortable doing the 8-4 offsuit, but this is what you should be doing when you're abusing the bubble. All right, Alan. See you later. So yeah, you need to be sure that he's opening pretty wide, and that he's obviously calling tight before you do this. That's a good. Is it pure guessing? No, it's not guessing at all. All you need to know is the guy a reg or is he a random? Just knowing whether some guy's a reg and a winning player, that means they understand ICM. That means they understand their proper ranges at this point. So if they understand ICM, then they understand that they can't call lightly in this spot. So there's a lot of good assumptions that you can make and basic assumptions based upon just knowing that, knowing whether they're a winning player or not. The only reason not to do this is they don't care about ICM. That's why I said this is a reg. Versus randoms, and I said this before about 3-betting to exploit. I'm 3-betting typically a value range versus randoms because they don't care about ICM. They call wider, and we don't want to put ourselves in that position. So, he can't even call with ace-king here. Okay? He could tell him, I have 8-4 offsuit, and he can't call probably with ace-king. Some will, some won't. He shouldn't. But then the question is, when we were doing our coaching session is 3-betting smaller here better? And how wide does this 4-betting range have to be to make the shove better? So let's open. ATM bubble exploit. I think this is it. I sure hope so. Yep. So we gave the guy who was raising for middle position this range for opening. Ace-5 off, ace-2 suited, some broadways, pocket pairs. So a question came in, or a comment. I think 3-bet jam is way better than 3-bet small in this particular spot. Because it looks like you'd be exploiting him and he can jam way wider than he can call. I think his 4-bet shoving range will be wider than his calling range if hero... than his calling range if the hero 3-bet shoves. That might be the case, right? And we'll go through it. We'll see how wide his 4-betting range would have to be. And that's the point. It's not to say that you can't 3-bet shove or that you have to 3-bet small. It's not as clear cut as raising versus shoving as we did in the previous sessions. But that's the question that you need to ask yourself when you're playing versus a particular player. And my default play typically is to 3-bet small until somebody proves to me that they're going to 4-bet wider. In high ICM spots, could he make the assumption that I know that he can raise me wide because he's the chip leader, therefore, since he's raising with any 2 cards, I can 3-bet him with any, or I can 4-bet him with any 2 cards, or my entire range? Potentially. That situation is there, and that's a distinction that you're going to have to make on your own. So let's see the EV here. Okay, so you can see that if he opens with this range, does anybody disagree with this range? Ace-5 off, ace-2 suited, pocket deuces, some broadways for opening. Maybe it's a little bit wider, maybe it's a little bit tighter. He's a 22, 18 type of player. And then I put him as only calling with jacks plus and ace-king suited. Maybe he should only call with queens plus. Obviously ace-king suited is not a good call. If you lose, you're going to be short stacked and bubble a lot. There's negative ICM factors here if he's calling lighter or opening too tight. So I agree with you. That's what I was just about to get into. This spot is very, very sensitive. Okay? So, yes, this is 0.39, but you need to be aware that this is based upon this calling range. If we tighten him up just a little bit, something like this, and maybe take out these hands. So what I take out, 4 or 5 hands? It's almost negative EV. It's break even. Oh, it's yeah, that's fantastic. So if you just take out a couple hands, this becomes negative EV in a hurry, and that's not a situation you want to put yourself in. So there are negative ICM situations. The question is it easier to 3-bet smaller? So let's just take a look at what 3-betting smaller looks like. Let's just say we go to 2,000. We don't 3-bet the minimum. That might give a little bit too much room to 4-bet us. Whoops. He's not going to be flatting here. he's going to be 4 betting. Now, a player would only be 4 betting here wider than they would call an all in if they feel you're doing this ultra wide. So it's very also important to understand the dynamics. Have you 3 bet him yet during this game? Have you been 3 betting the entire table? Or is this the first time you've ever 3 bet this guy? If it's the first time you've ever 3 bet him, then go with the 3 bet small, because he doesn't have reason to think otherwise. If you've been going nuts at the table with the big stack and you've been shoving, then I'd probably resort more to a 3 bet shove than a 3 bet small, because you take away their ability to even make an assumption that you're 3 betting wide, and you take away their ability to 4 bet. But it's good to take a look at this to see how wide his 4 betting needs to be. So how wide would he 4 bet? Let's just give him this range we said he was going to call with. And obviously we're going to fold. And obviously this is going to be very, very plus EV. Obviously 1.29. How wide does he have to 4 bet to make a shove better? Let's start including some of, maybe not that, stuff like this. So we went from like 2% to close to 6%. And so now we can see that it's 0.29%. So it's a little bit less. Actually, I'm sorry. I want to bring him back to what we had him doing before. So still quite profitable. How, is he 4 betting wider than that? Went from 2% to 8%, so 4 times as wide. 0.13. It's still profitable here, and the nice part of it is we're not risking our entire stack either. So it's a lower variance type of play. And I guess probably adding in these hands. And in there, that's when it becomes negative EV. Okay, when he starts 3 betting, 4 betting those hands. So why would he start 4 betting these hands? It's because he needs to be damn sure as well that you're 3 betting with any 2 cards. Just like you guys said, well, we need to be sure that if we're 3 bet jamming, that he's opening wide and calling with only a tight range. On the flip side, when we 3 bet smaller, he needs to be damn sure that we're also doing this with a wide range, or else he can't even go this wide with his 4 betting range. So that's, again, a question that you need to ask yourself when playing. What's my history with this player? Have I ever really done this to him? If not, go with the 3 bet small. If I have done this to him before, and I've been doing it nonstop, and I've been really aggressive, then I'll revert back to the unexploitable play for a couple hands. But I'll keep kind of going back and forth between the two if I start developing a history. So if I decide that 3 bet smaller is much more profitable than 3 bet shoving, then I'm at least going to want to mix that in every once in a while rather than always make the 3 bet shove, if that makes sense. So any questions about this? I thought it was a pretty good hand to go over, because it is a pretty common spot to jam wide over this guy who's second in chips. But it's a very sensitive spot as well, given the stack distribution. So in a perfect world, 3 betting small will work well in most spots if you can assume they're not flatting and they're not 4 betting extremely wide. If you have some history, then it's just like anything. If you have a history and you have a note on a player, and you have some leveling battles, then you need to adapt from that play as well. It's always about staying one step ahead. So any questions on that? All right. So as I said, words of caution with this. We're going to do this versus regs, not fishy players. Also, don't fall into the trap of polarizing your range. There was a guy that I used to play against all the time who was actually a pretty good player. And I've mentioned this before in other videos, and it's because it's always in my head about how this really good player became so obvious, and to make sure that you don't become so obvious, and that don't fall into the trap of 3 betting small as a bluff and 3-bet jamming or 3-betting bigger with your good hands. It became very obvious that that's what this one player was doing, and once I caught on to it, it was very easy to exploit him as well. And the way I caught him was because he started 3-betting me a little bit, and I had the fold because I had no reason to believe at first that he was 3-betting me ultra wide. And then I picked up pocket kings, and I raised, and he 3-bet me small, and instead of jamming over top, I just called him, and he was out of position, and he ended up jamming the flop and then flipping over king 9. So I knew, obviously, at that point that he was, he was 3-betting small essentially as a bluff, and so I would continue to open really wide through him, and every time he 3-bet me small, because he didn't adapt, every time he 3-bet small, I just 4-bet jammed over top of him with whatever I was opening. And if he 3-bet me bigger than the minimum, or he 3-bet jam me, obviously, then I wasn't, I was only calling with the appropriate range. So don't find yourself in that spot. Mix it up, keep players on their toes. You don't have to always 3-bet small, but you also don't always have to 3-bet jam. So hopefully seeing those calculations will give you a little bit of confidence to know that it's okay to 3-bet small against regs who are not going to flat. Just like we said, it's okay to raise with any 2 cards through regs who are not going to flat your raise. Okay? So the takeaways from this session obviously are more plays to add in. We talked about these aren't necessarily plays that you're going to do every single time, but if you add in the raise with any 2 cards over top of a reg who limps, the limp steal versus loose passive players, you incorporate a little bit more of 3-betting small in the right spots versus regs. That can be much more profitable than 3-bet jamming, and also give you the confidence to 3-bet with more hands, knowing that you don't have to risk your entire stack to do so. At the early stages, go ahead and just raise over top of, or not raise over top, but go ahead and raise from late position through regs. It's okay to pick up 45 chips, 60 chips here or there. And then versus the fishy random players, if you find yourself in late position on the button in the cutoff, and they limp in at big blind 50, big blind 100, when you have 15 big blinds or more, ISO raise them with queen 9 offsuit and 9-7 suit and stuff like that. That's essentially putting yourself in an advantageous position to pick up chips, and I'm always c-betting those spots as well. So no real theme today other than more plays to add in. Mix these with what we've done the first 2 sessions, and hopefully now you have 1, 2, the 5 or so strategies we went over today, at least 7 or 8 more plays that you can add into your game that you may not have been already using. And even if you have been using some of these, with stuff like raising instead of shoving, while they're both profitable plays, one is certainly more profitable than the other. So I hope that you've gotten some good information over these last 3 sessions. In terms of the boot camp now, the course, these 3 sessions were mine. I went through, I hopefully gave you some good strategies that you can add into your game right away. The 4th session that's coming up is going to be done by Makti Soni. Some of you may be familiar or not familiar with him. He's a Card Runners pro. He's a really solid sit-and-go player. He plays all sorts of game types. I know him as mainly a 9-man player, but I believe he's playing more hypers now. He is really good at HUD and database and note caddy use. So he's going to get even more advanced than when I was talking about taking notes and setting up your HUD. He's going to get even more advanced, so that if you're using NoteCaddy, or maybe if you're not and you're just taking notes, how NoteCaddy can be combined with your HUD stats so that you can exploit players even more and you get even more specific information against them. So that's why I wanted to have him come in as the 4th session, so that you see all these strategies, you know what stats to look for, but now you can go one step further, get an even more advanced look at utilizing your stats, and using that for exploiting players and getting more information, so that you're never guessing. You're just, exactly how players are going to play against you specifically, and you can take advantage of that. So that's what you have coming up in the 4th session. That is going to be next week. And Makti Soni, he also developed an alpha HUD, which he sells, which he's also going to be talking about at the end. so that for people that find it useful, it's already made for you. His HUD and NoteCaddy setup is already made for you. So that's what you can expect. Obviously, there's no a requirement to buy anything. That wasn't the point of the session. It was more to show you how to use your Hold'em Manager and NoteCaddy to exploit players and how to use your database. And if you want a shortcut to doing that, he's developed that for you. So hopefully, you'll get some good information from that session and that you can apply it to the strategies we talked about here. So this will be the last session where you hear my lovely voice. I hope you guys have gotten a lot of information out of these sessions, and that you can go and start crushing games and being more profitable and taking advantage of the regs. So thanks for joining in. As always, use the Skype group. Message me anytime. I'm on Skype probably way too much, and message me anytime with questions, and obviously use the forum as well. So with that, I'll open it up one last time. Any questions on anything we went over today? Just want to make sure everything's clear because I know we kind of bounced around. All right. So if any questions pop up, obviously message me anytime. So thanks for joining in, guys. I've run this course several times. The questions you guys have asked have been great. These are probably the most questions I've received when going through this course. So I appreciate all the questions. I think it's really enhanced the content as well. So thanks, guys, and I'll have the recording for you hopefully within the next 24 hours. All right, guys. See ya.